A common misconception amongst modern historians and their students is that the title of Dominion refers to the dominion of man. It most certainly does not. The original inhabitants referred instead to the dominion of Hazila, the Pantocrator, the god of mankind, and with his fall the dominion ended, but did not die. Far to the east of the 100 Kingdoms, past the Clusterine Mountains and the desert wasteland beyond it, lies the heartlands of the Old Dominion. Once a continent-spawning power, the legions of the Old Dominion were powerful enough to threaten even the eldest races of the Dweghom and the Spires into acquiescence, or at least a semblance of it. Past the once steaming valleys and fertile plains of the heartland lie the river valleys upon which Capitas, the greatest city of humanity ever built, was founded. And it is here amongst the ruins of the holiest of cities of man that the remnants of Hazila fell. Wounded unto death, but immortal and driven to a towering rage by the betrayal of his subjects, Hazila was pushed beyond the limits of despair and rage. In his hubris, he sought to end the Old Dominion, but was foiled by the sacrifice of another member of the pantheon, Ninuach, the Mother. Denied, broken, and driven well past the edge of madness, Hazila reached out to whatever power could answer his desperate need to avenge himself and punish his betrayal. And one answered. Death, the third incarnate soul of destruction, had been bound beyond the reach of any being, living or dead. But Hazila now stood in the threshold of both and could hear his call. Bending all his divine might, Hazila was able to carve his way into death's prison as he fell. What happened within that forsaken realm is beyond the understanding of mortals and immortals alike. But from the unholy fusion of those two polar primordial elements, an unholy amalgam was born. Undeath. Animate but unalive, aware but unsouled, a new primordial paradigm was born. Its rage-filled birth cry infused the thousands upon thousands of death in Capitas and the Old Dominion beyond with a fraction of his essence, granting them a ghastly unlife. The spiritual connection the deceased had with Hazila made this transfer not just possible, but remarkably easy. In fact, this birth cry was so powerful and uncontrollable that Hazila poured too much of his essence into it, becoming little more than a single directive that lived within each of his undead creations: slay the living. Almost no records of the butchery that followed exist outside of the most secret vaults of the Order of the Ashen Dawn. What little knowledge of the spirit exists is embedded into the dark myths and legends of the Ras, the last of mankind to flee the Old Dominion across the Clusterine Range to freedom. They alone, amongst all the remnants of mankind, were forced to face the untrammeled horror of Hazila's rage and despair made manifest, and their myths, legends, and cultural outlook reflect this. Through the selfless sacrifice of the last legion and the last remaining god of the triumvirate, Cleon, Hazila's horde was defeated. But a primordial power as old and vast as a horseman, even a corrupted one, cannot be defeated, merely contained. And so it was that Hazila's power and his will were severed. What the Legion did with his will remains the single most closely guarded secret of mankind, but his power has raged unchecked for centuries in the heart of the Old Dominion. In the center of Capitas there is a gigantic pit from which blazes a miles-high beacon of unlight, a powerful beam of dark fire that casts as much shadow as it does light, shrouding the entire city in a hellish glow of dancing shadows. This is the unfettered and unbound essence of Hazila, fallen god of mankind. It is a corruption unlike anything that ever came before it, and has sung its siren song for centuries, drawing the mad, the broken, the despairing, and the power-hungry to it like moths to a flame. Over the centuries, hundreds, if not thousands of mortals have answered the call. Of these, only a mere handful survived, and they are the anointed, the prophet, the warlord, the speaker, the seer, the howler, the keeper, the branded, the whisperer, and the broken. The first whisper of their names is starting to be heard in the lands of man, a whisper that will soon burgeon to become a storm. Into sub-factions. The final creed. Even as Hazila fell, some of his priests led prayers in his name while the panicked population of the city tried to escape. Even as the shockwave tore through Capitas and reduced the city to rubble, they chanted his praise while being torn to pieces by flying rubble in an enraged mob. Even as Hazila's unbirth blanketed the land in a peril of death and darkness, ripping the life from all but the hardiest, they called out his name with reckless abandon, and his name might be the last thing to pass their lips. Even as Hazila's dark will was made manifest, and the dead walked once more to slay the living, they cried out his name in joyous communion, and somehow managed to survive. They are the apostles of the final creed, the last and most fervent worshippers of Hazila that ever walked the earth, and their task is not complete. Shielded from Hazila's baleful power by countless meters of rock, a maze of storerooms and dusty workshops lying next to the forgotten sepulchres, abandoned mausoleums, and long-neglected naves carved into the living rock. This is where the priesthood of the final creed carries on its work of bringing Hazila's vision to the world. Once that meant marching with Hazila's untold legions and bringing death to any mortal creature that stood in their way, utilizing their divine and sorcerous gifts to complement the unthinking savagery and endless numbers of Hazila's unliving tide. With Hazila's defeat and partial imprisonment, the creed retreated to Capitas, humbled and broken, settling next to the pyre, that unceasing torrent of corrupted primordial power that fountains from the epicenter of the fall in the center of the dead city. Their leader, his original name lost to time and madness, committed ritual suicide by walking into the pyre. Even as their reduced number contemplated oblivion, for only a handful have survived to this point, the first of the pilgrims began to arrive. Driven by the need or pulled by madness or fate, a few crazed survivors started trickling into Capitas. Their sanity blasted by the sights they had seen, or perhaps lost well before by the heinous acts they had committed, the pyre called them across Ea, and they proved the fertile seeding ground for the apocalyptic faith of the final creed. And so, with the vast majority of the unliving tide defeated and their reduced numbers, the cult was in a trajectory to become a little more than a ghastly footnote in the history of man. All of that changed with the arrival of the prophet, the first anointed. Stepping forth from the twisted primordial flames of the pyre, the prophet rejoined his brethren, forged anew in the unholy furnace of his god's impotent rage. Their former leader had cast away all his mortal weakness and became a living vessel of his god's power and purpose. For while Hazila will have been bound, his power remained available for those desperate, or crazy, or faithful enough to claim it. Gifted with a fraction of Hazila's corrupt essence, the prophet rekindled the dying embers of the final creed's fate. Channeling his newfound powers, the prophet sought to recreate Hazila's undead tide and scour the world clean of sentient life, only to find that his powers were no match for those of Hazila. He could not reanimate more than a scant few thousand corpses. Years and decades of studies and horrible experiments followed as the final creed sought to appease their dark master's reincarnation. But progress was slow. Hundreds were sacrificed on the altars to fuel his mad quest for power, and their bodies reanimated in a vain attempt to recreate the legions Hazila once commanded. Having cast off his mortal frailties, the prophet cared not for how far he pushed his servant, driving the cult to the edge of extinction time and time again. Disgusted by the frail efforts of his mortal followers, the prophet turned further and further away from them, dedicating himself to his own vile studies and experiments. Despite his best efforts, the prophet was forced to concede while his attunement to his god could grow with time and sacrifice. Only those who were sworn to Hazila in life could be reanimated in death. The prophet was undeterred, however. He might not be able to follow in his master's footsteps, but he could certainly complete his great undertaking. It would simply take time. Time he now had. Returning to his followers, the prophet was shocked to discover that he was no longer the only power in Capitas. Others had taken advantage of his long sojourn into the dark secrets of mortality and divinity, and usurped a portion of his god's power, twisting it to their end. Where once he alone commanded the baleful power of Hazila, others now dared to tread. Adding insult to injury, his harsh treatment of the final creed and his subsequent abandonment had left the cult ripe for treason and sedation. Many of his favorite followers had cast their lot with these usurpers, while he alone remained the true master of these dark arts. His enemies now benefited from years of careful research and dark secrets he alone had been privy to. Enraged beyond reason, the Prophet marched his forces to take down these usurpers, these anointed, and reclaim his primacy as Hazila's chosen. The war that raged in Capitas and the dark deserts beyond was the stuff of nightmares that thankfully no sane mortal was forced to witness. Undead legions marched upon each other and clashed for days on end, their bodies as tireless as their master's spite. At first, the Prophet was successful and managed to bring down a few of the anointed, fueling his power with their own. But his resources had been stretched thin. Maintaining his control over Capitas and his own trove of suitable cadavers and bodies was no match for the reanimated legions his opponents could marshal from the burial grounds scattered across the empire. Worse still, the longer the war raged, the more irreplaceable bodies were being lost, and with them the hopes of conquering the mortal realms. Faced with these direct facts and the united opposition of the remaining anointed, the Prophet was forced to concede defeat. To preserve his master's dark legacy, the Prophet agreed in desperation to share Capitas and reform the final creed. It would now serve all the anointed equally and share what knowledge and influence he had amassed with all anointed. This is how the final creed came to take its current form. Today, countless servitors labor daily beneath the oppressive oversight of their unliving masters to uncover more suitable bodies in the forgotten tombs and catacombs of the Old Dominion to fuel their dark design. Morticians and sculptors labor together to repair these bodies that were ravaged by time or battle, seeking to restore their function by replacing their lost parts with replacements carefully carved from the very stones of Capitas. Stones that have witnessed Hazila's darkest laughter and bathed in his baleful power for centuries. Some go even further, seeking to combine these unholy remnants with the will of his most loyal lost followers to create unstoppable engines of destruction, all to bring their death god's will upon the mortal world. The fallen pantheon. The pantheon of the Old Dominion were once mankind's greatest allies, a gathering of puissant primordial powers dedicated to fostering a nascent mankind's beset by the countless perils. While Hazila led it, he was not always the most powerful entity within it. Cleon, the Lord of Valor, and Ninhua, the Merciful Mother, were entities even older than himself who had, for their own reasons, been benevolent to the stripling race of man. Interestingly, tied to their aspects, these divinities could not rise as fast or as far as Hazila, who would eventually come to eclipse them. In time, Hazila became aware that the Trinity was simply not enough to satisfy the ever-growing needs and demands of mankind, and so struck a plan to create divinities from the smallest and faintest of the mote's creation. Much like himself before man's worship, these motes lacked any sentience or direction and merely drifted through the ether. With an intrinsic understanding of divinity and the power of belief, Hazila quickly set to create loyal servants and heralds to satisfy the growing demands of his followers. The process, in essence, was simple. All Hazila had to do was name and define these celestials and channel a portion of his own power into them. Thus quickened, channeled human fate would rush to them, empowering them and shaping them at the same time, creating the gods that man himself had envisioned under Hazila's guiding eye. Over the course of centuries, the pantheon became populated with a plethora of angels, saints, and heralds. An entirely new field of theology had to be created merely to attempt to catalog and name the countless divine servants that crowded the heavens of the Old Dominion. Seraphim, cherubims, powers, and saints all toiled together to enact the will of Hazila upon the world. Depending on their role and importance, these beings could continue growing in power and awareness, becoming minor divinities in their own right, such as Himeros, the god of winter, or Selene, the lady of secrets and the moon, but always subservient to the will of the Pantocrator, Hazila. While few are aware of it today, the horrific events of the fall had a cataclysmic effect on the pantheon. As the ritual of the sorcerers reached its zenith, Hazila became aware of their efforts and bent every effort and means he had to ensure their destruction. Almost the entire pantheon was unleashed against their upstart humans who sought to attack their god, but to no avail. Centuries of familiarity and worship had armed the sorcerers with all the information they needed to defeat their celestial foes. Countless died in the opening salvos of the conflict, and hundreds more died to no avail before the ritual was complete. Those few who had survived, often most powerful and aware, perished in the immediate aftermath of the casting, as Hazila called on their power in an attempt to resist the fate the human sorcerers had unleashed upon him. Broken winged angels stumbled from the heavens, even as sacred statues and shrines cracked and collapsed under the divine onslaught, and their drained, inanimate husks rained down on Capitas for hours before Hazila was overpowered and cast down from the heavens. For those few celestials who survived the fall, an even darker fate was reserved: the unbirthed. As Hazila consumed and was consumed by death, the abhorrent primordial energy of that unholy coupling flooded Capitas. Those few celestials who had survived were still linked to Hazila and were utterly overwhelmed. As the ungod's cry echoes across the heavens and the dead stirred to life, the hapless divinities were irredeemably corrupt by the energy that consumed their god, and rose once more as dark reflections of all they once stood for. Chimeros, the hungering dark, and Selene, who stalks the night, are just a few of the horrors birthed in that apocalypse. How many succumbed to this fate? Few can say, for they thankfully remain bound to the pyre and Hazila's baleful energies, sparing the world of their horror. But that innocence is about to be shattered. As the anointed prepare for war and the final creed stirs, the fallen pantheon has finally found the means to escape their captivity. For both these terrifying groups have discovered how to once more call forth the pantheon to inflict Hazila's vision upon the world. As embodiments of Hazila himself, the anointed possess enough of Hazila's power to sustain a portion of the pantheon even away from the pyre, while the final creed has discovered that the greatest reliquaries of the old faith and the desecrated bodies of these divinities can be infused to sustain the immortal soul of their occupants with sufficient sacrifice. Far from the mindless automata, the remnants of the pantheon are possessed of powerful will, and even the anointed must negotiate with them to secure their service. So the legions of the Old Dominion march to battle once more, wrapped in the dark and glorious majesty of the members of the fallen pantheon. May the gods have mercy upon us all, for they will not. The legions. And the moments that followed the final act of the fall and the unholy amalgam that was spawned, the ungod's maddened sentience reached out to all available vessels. And at the time those vessels were plenty, for any still and soulless body would do. Countless dead, an empire of them in fact, would be filled with a mockery of life, a twisted vigor of creation instilled with the emptiness of death. These endless hosts were for the most part lacking purpose or guidance. The will of the ungod to spread and to scatter, to offer either, and the life-ending power that existed in that moment of history was contained by its own numbers. But as decades and centuries passed, this explosion of unlife would settle. The new unnatural primal force would meet its limitations and be reined in by them. The ungod was shaped partially by fate, the same fate that had shaped Hazila. Those sworn to him would forever remain vessels of his will. And in the endless catacombs under Capitas, the legions of the faithful were waiting with eternal patience. It is believed that the adoption of the mummification practice began Hazila's semi-primitive clergy during the times of the first tribe, inspired by the sealed bodies of Dweghom found in the hold where Hazila was discovered. The priests of the fledgling god would research ways in which their bodies could be preserved so that they could serve their god in the afterlife. It is perhaps only natural that the practice would be transferred to all members of the Dominion's legions. After all, the origin of the legion was a group of warrior priests of the first tribe, equipped by Hazila's ingenuity and dedicated to the expansion of his worship. The practice was continued not simply as mandate of tradition, but as a core element of the worship of Hazila. Chapels dedicated to mummification were built throughout the lands of the Old Dominion to serve the needs of those officials and warriors stationed there. In Capitas, however, an entire district, the postern, would be covered by the scent of embalming fluid mixed with the aroma of ceremonial censers. In its center stood the halls of Orcos, where the Ramhadati, priests of the seer, would perform their gruesome task on the bodies of legionnaires and the clergy. In its vast rooms, rows upon rows of stone slabs would host countless bodies throughout the centuries of the Old Dominion. Its warehouses filled with the extracted organs of the faithful, as well as spare extremities, for the bodies of warriors would often need restoration before preservation. With the exception of privately built and owned mausoleums by the wealthiest families, all of Hazila's faithful were transferred back to Capitas to be sent to their final resting place, the Still Lake, a massive natural complex of caves filled with underground rivers and lakes, which would eventually become the single largest mausoleum in the history of mankind. Processions for the dead legionnaires, their bodies covered by a sheet and in full armor, would start from Hazila's tomb in the center of Capitas to the entrance of the Hall of Orcos, placed on a ceremonial boat. From the bowels of the hall where the Still Lake awaited, they would be taken to their final resting place. Tombs specially prepared and enhanced to keep the humidity at bay. It would not be long before the natural caves would be replaced by rows upon rows of these ornate tombs, forever encased in darkness and the soft sounds of water dripping in the still waters. To debate his genius is to debate eternity. This dogmatic paradigm in the lips of Hazila's clergy was in the end spat with anger by those fleeing from the destruction of the fall. Yet as centuries have passed since the praise of their god's forethought was filled with bitter irony, one cannot but wonder if this mortal sentiment was short-sighted and premature. Could the legions awaiting in the Still Lake be part of Hazila's plan, or at the very least, a glimpse of his divine foresight? Many of the few that know such things debate this. Some, respectful of the subtle influence of the death part in the ungod, remember this Ovidus: "They will bring you their lost, but know not why." Even Hazila could not escape the pool of a true primordial, they claim. Others saw a simpler, perhaps, explanation. His fall, they say, proves that Hazila was neither all-powerful nor all-seeing, and chance, for better or worse, is her own mistress. From the very beginning of his dominion to his own maddened end, Hazila made plans within plans, weave contingencies upon contingencies. What the original plan behind his schemes was, probably no mortal can truly grasp, but it simply happened to serve him in his own life. Moving on to forces. Siarak. The profession natural of the Old Dominion army was best exemplified by its officer Kader. A Siarak, a commander of 1,000 men, was both elected by his troops and trained by Dominion. Only those who had previously reached the rank of centurion were eligible to become Siaraks, who upon election traveled to Capitas to be trained in grammar, arithmetic, and logistics, allowing them to become the professional officer corps that the legion needed to dominate the continent. Their exalted rank inevitably meant that they were buried in full honors and ceremony, their embalming process and the intermittent services much more thorough and complex than that of a simple legionnaire. As such, when raised as unliving vessels by the ungod, they retained their cognitive capacity, unlike the legionnaires who retained but a vestige of their former selves. Archimandrite. When the fall occurred, the vast majority of Hazila's priesthood was obliterated along with Capitas, the capital of the theocratic dominion. Those who survive today and have taken the mantle of the last creed are the spiritual descendants not of the central priesthood, which was annihilated along with Capitas, but of the monastic orders that thrive beyond the reach of Capitas' influence. Amongst the oldest and most dangerous members of the last creed are the Archimandrites, each blessed in the vile might of the ungod and steeped in the mysteries and rituals of his dark church. Their monasteries abandoned in return of cells deep within the bedrock beneath Capitas. These blasphemous creatures command the absolute loyalty of 1,000 or so acolytes who lead the depraved followers of the apocalyptic cult so readily found in the dying lands to the north, as well as many undying legionnaires and monstrosities as their dark arts allowed them to create. Strategos. A strategos is the supreme commander of a Dominion legion, a master of men who commanded the absolute loyalty of his troops, serving as their temporal and spiritual leader while on campaign. His mastery was one of strategy and diplomacy, allowing his officers, the 10 Silaraks, who served under him to focus on logistics, tactics, and the disposition of the troops. And to him, with all the pomp and ceremony one could expect, their awakening into an unlife of service is complete with misery and loss. For unlike the lesser order, they do not only retain their cognitive function, but memories from before. This makes them a double-edged sword for those who would seek to command them. While one of the easiest and most efficient ways to secure the performance and power of an awakened legion, the strategoi are no unthinking minions to command. Their cognitive function and memories have allowed them to retain their personalities, and with it, ambition. Herodican. The fall of Hazila and his pantheons shook even the fervent believers who would ultimately embrace the apocalyptic dogma of the final creed. When the voice of their god vanished after his defeat at the hands of Cleon and the last legion, many of his followers fell into despair. However, even the most zealous of his followers could hear the howling cacophony of 100 hungering divinities trapped within the pyre that burns in the center of Capitas. Fallen divinities that only need a few faithful followers, self-ordained hierodecans, to preach their word and carry out their mission of sin, that their new masters might unleash a millennia of malice and hatred upon the world. Fallen divinity. Once noble paragons of the Dominion's pantheon, but long since corrupted by Hazila's fall, fallen divinities are quite simply the most dangerous foes mankind has encountered to date. Thankfully, the trauma of the fall and the valiant efforts of Cleon during the Theomachia that followed have crippled and contained the power of these abhorrent beings. This means that they can be opposed by mortal arms for a brief spell, that vulnerable moment between their manifestation before they had the chance to feast upon the dark power released by the destruction of their followers. The Mounted Strategos. The origins of chivalry and the feudal order can, like most all institutions of the 100 Kingdoms, be traced back to the establishment of the Cataphracti Tagmata in the Old Dominion. Their cost of their mount, equipment, and deployment, as well as effectiveness on the battlefield, set these warriors on a league of their own. A mounted strategos is the epitome of this ancient warrior code, a paragon of a bygone age mounted on his ritual companion, whose faded glory and tattered panoply cannot dim the blazing intellect and sheer will that smothered within this faded vessel. Optio. Second in command to the Centaurs, the lowest ranked officer minted by the Collegia of the Old Dominion, the Optio is a stern, experienced veteran whose responsibility it is that an officer's orders be obeyed or ignored. When the Imperial Legions were born, veteran commanders quickly realized they needed a linchpin between the professional officer corps being produced by the collegiates and the veteran legionaries that formed the backbone of all legions. Dark Cenotaph. Throughout the history of the Old Dominion, each legion had a separate interment site where all the recovered bodies of its fallen legionnaires and officers were buried, crowning each of these Spartan necropolises as Centotaph, a memorial to those who fell but were never recovered. A locus for the enduring pride of the legion, any foe fighting under its dark power knows he faces not only the relentless dead in front of him, but the combined will of those countless legionnaires whose bodies were not recovered. Profane Reliquary. When Hazila fell, countless fragments of his divine realm were recovered by his devoted servants across the length and breadth of Capitas. These small fragments of divinity retain the power to animate and agitate the normally compliant souls of the ungod's faithful, rousing them and allowing a small fraction of his deathly will to spill over into the world, sapping the very life force and vitality of his foes. Hetairos. In the early days of the Old Dominion, the Catophractoi were the Councilor's chosen companions, or Hetairoi, armed with the finest arms and armor he could furnish, and mounted atop the greatest steeds he could find. As the Old Dominion evolved, these ancient formations were abandoned, but not the title of Hetairos. Granted to the greatest champion of the Old Dominion, this was a title granted only by the Calsor himself for deeds of valor upon the field of battle. Some of that prowess and glory remain in their withered remnants, and the Hetairoi are the first among equals in the Cataphractoi warband, their mere presence reminding their companions of the glorious charges of ages past. Keres. Those cultists who lack the ambition or brilliance required to reach on life on their own terms are granted one final chance to become one with their lord. In the final hours of their life, they climb onto a bonfire lit with the unholy flames of the pyre. Keres are the animated chaur remains of those who managed to not go insane. The Moroi are not so lucky. Legionnaires. While it was once arguable whether the legions of the Old Dominion were the most feared fighting force on Ea, few would dare disagree today. Devoted to their lord in life and unlife, what the legionnaires of the Old Dominion have lost in speed, they more than make up in remorseless discipline and relentlessness. The Praetorian Guard. Once the premier fighting force of the Old Dominion, the Praetorian Guard eventually lost favor amongst their charges, the Calasors, for being more loyal to their god than to themselves. Twice doomed for their loyalty, the Praetorian Guard now possesses the dubious honor of being one of the few troops in the Old Dominion forces who retain some sense of self despite possession by Hazila's power. Cataphractoi. Armed from head to toe, Cataphractoi were the precursors to the noble idea of the knights. Raised in undead, these horsemen became a terrifying force on the battlefield, their effectiveness compounded by the fact neither the horse nor the rider know fear or pain, allowing them to slam into enemy formations with a ferocity no mortal foe could match. Caryatids. While Hazila's fall and subsequent annihilation of the population of Capitas infused the very stones of Capitas with its power, nowhere was this more evident than in his greatest temples. Here the very blood of Hazila oozed from the walls, infusing his holiest icons and statuary with a dark parody of life. The beautiful caryatids that once ringed the great temple's temenoi have come to life, and a grotesque parody of their ritual purpose now hunt down all interlopers in their god's dominion. Only the most zealous and dedicated of Hazila's servants can hope to bind these unholy creations in common purpose to unleash their horror upon the battlefield. Where missiles created of divine blood in sheer spite make a mockery of mortal armor and flesh. Athanatoi. Precursors to the lauded Praetorians, the origin of Athanatoi is shrouded in the myths and legends that churned around the birth of the Dominion and its early forces. Faceless and remorseless, they were the god's will made manifest in mortal hands. The ranks of these Athanatoi were capped at 1,000 to be replenished from a pool of the most talented warriors the Dominion had to offer should one of them fall in battle. Now even in death they serve, bringing their god's judgment on all those foolish enough to think they can stand before these immortals. Bone golems. In their quest for knowledge, the Dark Creed uncovered many secrets best left alone. Prime among them was the fact that the very stones of Capitas were soaked with so much death and so much of Hazila's essence during the fall that all they needed to heed their master's call to murder the living was simple motivating consciousness. These massive constructs wreak havoc on the battlefield, their massive forms soaking unbelievable levels of damage as their massive limbs sigh through enemy formations. Canephoros. Deep within the greatest temples of Capitas, one could find the Telestria, great halls in which people were initiated into the mysteries of Hazila's cult. Ringing these richly appointed halls, dozens upon dozens of Canephoros stood guard, bearing the bounty and gifts their lord would shower onto Hazila's new initiates. In a dark parody of their former role, these terrifying animate constructs can be unleashed upon the battlefield to deliver their god's last gift, death. The Varangian Guard. It is the nature of power to corrupt. Few individuals were as aware of this universal truth as the Calasors of the Old Dominion. Like the Praetorians replaced the Athanatoi in their unbending devotion to the right of Hazila, so were the Varangians established upon the ashes of the Praetorian Guard when their mortal weakness and thirst for power saw them betray their leaders. Through the centuries of unrest and the fall that followed, the Varangians have stood guard over the Calasors and those closest to them, bringing bloody death and vengeance to any who would dare harm them. The Bucephaloi. The Bucephaloi of the Old Dominion were the sacred guardians of its holiest sites. Clad in beautiful ceremonial panoplies, these simple and devout guardians were selected from amongst the most powerful of Minotaur Tahirians, their horns ritually cut off in an act of devotion and their subservience to Hazila. Such was the power and majesty of the Bucephaloi that only in death were they called to battle, while alive none dare oppose them. The Kirschborough Expedition. Even if a secret kept from the general population, the existence of the undead remnants of the Old Dominion had been known to humankind for centuries. This knowledge has primarily been preserved and safeguarded by the orders and the higher echelons of power in the city-state of Acheron, who have historically monitored and guarded the passages to the east, while most of the times the Wardun would dissuade or eliminate most stragglers that managed to pass through those 2 human centuries. Despite their best efforts, however, curiosity, scholarly pursuits, misguided worship, and the promise of an entire civilization's worth of treasure, not to mention the fall call of the pyre, have been singing their siren call, attracting people from all sorts of life to the broken remains of Capitas. The few that have fled with their lives after witnessing the current state of the Old Dominion have sparked misbelieved tales about the dead hunting the living, but that is about as far as the truth has been preserved amongst the general population. Shielded from such truths were even the last few emperors. In 501 PR, Emperor Otto III the Accursed saw his reputation and influence dwindled after his marriage to Myrina of Leon, a pronounced deist, and the church turned almost openly against him, refusing to donate the Palatine to the Empress and founding the Panenticum in its stead. Despite his own indifference, a childhood friend and Tia's sympathizer, Duke Gabriel von Kirschborough, urged him to keep some kind of goodwill between him and the Holy Father, and the 2 men eventually agreed that recovery of a champion's artifact from the Old Dominion would serve the Emperor's purpose. An expedition led by the Duke and founded personally by the Emperor would embark in secret to recover such an artifact. Of the total of 40 men, only 5 returned alive, and the expedition's purpose and findings were never revealed save to a handful of individuals. Herein follows the surviving account of Square Gerald of Rim as found in the classified section of the Panenticum's library. The abomination with its bannermen stood within range of our archers. We rode out, my Lord Gabriel, Father Matthias of Hegu, Bannerman First Class Peter Schultz, and myself as squire to His Excellency to meet it. The differences to the other creatures based on the scouts' reports and our own observations were apparent. Unlike the bannerman next to it and the dozens of other creatures behind it, it looked as if its armor protected something more than just bones. Strips of cloth escaped the plating and ceremonial attire, possibly strapping dead, rotten flesh to the bone. A death mask adorned with a crown of sun rays covered its face. Its bannerman held a golden solifer like those of the old empire, albeit torn and tattered, much like the death mask of the creature. My Lord Gabriel was expressionless, but for those who knew him best, for I could see the anger that danced silently in his eyes when they fell on the banner. "Who are you?" he asked the masked one, as if talking to a man. To my surprise, the thing replied. Its torso did not move as it spoke, nor did the neck flex. There was no breath behind the words, only the mask stirring slightly as the mouth moved behind it. The voice was low and muffled, whispered, barely strong enough to reach our ears. Father Matthias circled his heart. Bannerman Schultz tried to calm his mare, which stomped the ground nervously. "We are one," it said. "We are the name you do not speak. We are the light at the end of thy prayers. Where do you come from?" "We always were." My Lord Gabriel paused, troubled. "Who are you?" he asked again. "We are—" "No!" my lord interrupted. "You! Who are you?" The creature simply stared at him for some moments. It struggled to pronounce, almost coughing as if the word was foreign. "Am Keeper." "That is no name." "No." "Is that a nickname then? A role?" "No." "Then answer who it is I." "Are you Keeper, the commander of this army?" "No." "Is there a commander, a king, an emperor, a general among you?" "No." Then are you the only author? Yes, sighed dozens pairs of dead lips, as if with pleasure for finally admitting this. The wind carried the word and made it bounce against the sides of the rocky path, making our torches dance nervously and bringing it to our ears again and again, as if by reflex their whole army had answered. And I cannot deny it sent our hearts to race, our horses to falter, our guts grow numb and cold. All the dead have spoken, all but the keeper. I, it whispered, struggling again once the echoes died out, am not. We are one. You do not see, Gabriel, yet we are as clear as day. It went on, tilting its head. It was hard to discern its tone, but I sensed uncertainty dressing its voice. I am under the impression that as time passed, it seemed to be able to communicate better, and that uncertainty fading. How do you know my name? Speak, fiend, before I... demanded my lord, but his words were cut again. As one, the dead raised their shields, and the bowmen reached for their arrow, angry sighs and muted growls reaching our ears. We reached for our swords, but they stopped as suddenly as they had started. You will not speak thus to us, the keeper said slowly, its head lowered. Then it went on, raising its head to look at my lord, the army behind it falling at ease once more. We know your name, yes, it said after a while. It echoes in my mind. Words at dawn, murmurs in my head. Do you see? The question, I felt, held significance, as if the creature itself was uncertain of the answer. No, creature, I do not, but I swear to us. Again a reflex, a sigh more than a reply, and again the twofold feeling. It felt like a command, but also a plea. You unholy. My lord, said I hurriedly, trying to appease to him, and I remember my throat was dry. I do not hide that I fear the creatures just as I feared my lord's reaction. So be it, he muttered, controlling himself before talking to the keeper, his words more like a growl than a greeting. I am Duke Gabriel von Kirschborough, in the name of His Imperial Majesty Otto III, Emperor Divine of Mank. They all reacted as one, once more. They made a sound like drawing a single endless choking breath, like wind trapped in a narrow tunnel, gaining speed and might and volume with every moment. I felt the back of my hair rise, and the bitter taste of terror filled my mouth as our men exclaimed in fear and reached for their weapons before our lord raised his hand. I think now that the dead were laughing. Stand aside, creature, my lord growled over their sound. In the name of the Emperor, I demand... All of a sudden their laugh ceased, and deathly silence fell among their troops, even as the keeper spoke. You do not. It almost growled in anger, but it stopped. When it went on, it was the same low tone. Demand, and we shall not command. We shall offer, once. I believe it was the creature's intention to try and sound pleasant when it spoke. We bring only peace. Love us. We do. Return to us. We did to you. Accept our offer. My lord Gabriel did not answer. He looked at the armor of the old empire, the ceremonial death mask of the keeper, and finally the Solifer, the dawning sun, a sun similar to his own lordship's banner bore. I do not know what he thought, and he never shared, then or later. What is your offer? He asked at last. Once again the answer came from all, only this time it was no whisper, it was no sigh, it was a statement. A promise, certain and inescapable, echoing like distant thunder slowly reaching us in the confines of the past. Death. Behind the golden mask, I felt the smile of the keeper. We bring only peace, it repeated. The apostate Chelisor. A common misconception about the Old Dominion is the impression of a single civilization, an empire that was built slowly but with an almost streaming course through history. This view is not without flaws. As Hazila changed and his understanding of both himself and the world was being altered, the dogma of the theocracy shifted with him, as did the face of his empire. Much like any other long-lasting state, the Old Dominion passed through different stages and had to endure different challenges. from both within and without, and withstand the tests of time. In fact, the term Domini Dominium, or the Lord's Dominion, which would come to overshadow the Empire's multifaceted history, was coined much later when the Dominion had almost carved its final border on the continent's map, a mere few hundred years before its decline and the fall. And one man above all else was responsible for this final and catalytic change, the apostate chaur. Clatovis Primus Iulianus was a member of the Primari tribe who claimed to be the descendants of the first tribe and nephew of Constantinus Primus, one of the most celebrated chaurs of that period. His entire life he was being groomed to ascend upon the office of chaur and to lead Hazila's unified people. This grooming was, of course, tailored to the needs of a theocracy. Administrative training walked hand in hand with rhetoric and political studies, in addition, of course, to theology, divine philosophy, and even the ascetic life of clergymen. Tutored by the best in their respective fields, Glavotis, mentors, and spiritual fathers were numerous and widely recognized from his parents' time, paving the way for his inevitable ascension. Claudius proved a quick study. His memorizing skills and unparalleled education, however, was not always matched by his natural talent or instinct. Entrusted by his uncle with drowning the second rebellion of the Silvic and the Rus tribes of the north, his initial success eventually turned into a partial disaster, as his textbook strategies were quickly recognized and countered by the rebels. His successor, Pectusimus, met with his own failures, and those proved to be his only redeeming factor, as the general opinion attributed the loss to the ferocity of the rebels rather than the failures of their own generals. Still, according to most historic accounts, the campaign was a typical representation of Claudius's faults, namely a rather dogmatic and traditionalistic mind that often failed to recognize the need for adaptations and adopt those as necessary. Despite that, however, Claudius' education prominently ticked all the boxes, and his theological papers reflected his deep knowledge and understanding of Hazila's dogma. His career in the clergy, and therefore his political career, proved to be a straight line to the higher echelons of power. There, however, his streamlined career came to an end, for with the death of Constantinus at the heart of Hazila's dominion, a schism was being carved between the people and the newly elected chaur, Iulianus. As with any period of political unrest in the Old Dominion, the true cause behind the schism was a debate concerning dogma, which always reflected the shift in Hazila's own views and goals. Constantinus had ruled most of his life according to the paradigms of old, assuming a series of honorifics that reflected the pantheon's triumvirate as rulers of divinity and humankind alike. But after the failures of both his nephew and his successor in the campaign against the rebel tribes, Constantinus led the last expedition himself, bringing the province back into the fold with ruthless efficiency while recovering numerous artifacts of the first tribe from the rebels. Based on these newfound relics, as well as his popularity upon his return, he was hailed as the Will of the Pantocrator, a term much used by the common folk about Hazila, but never canonized in the hymns of the church until then, and which means almighty, all-holding, or all-dominant. Before his death, the whole series of honorifics that chaur bore would reshape to reflect the new dogma, with Hazila as the Pantocrator. These titles would come to enhance the power of the chaur's seat, drifting away from the paradigm of a leader among equals and reflecting the power shifts to the heavens, where Hazila was ready to claim his position as sole and undisputed leader of the pantheon. The gap left by Constantinus' death would prove hard to fill. The late chaur was much beloved by the people of Capitas, who had readily adopted his preachings and the shifts in dogma he had proposed through both action and words. The rest of the theocracy, however, was not as eager to adopt such changes, seeing the influence of their own gods shrink before the new paradigm and their own power and influence slip away. The compromise was Iulianus, whose family ties with Constantinus would appease the population and the former chaur supporters, while his textbook approach to administration would ensure that the status quo in the theocracy would not be disturbed. Iulianus, however, had different plans. While he dismissed the title of the Will of the Pantocrator, Iulianus readily adopted and enhanced upon the reinforced powers that Constantinus had brought to the Celasaur's office, only to use them in order to achieve a return to the traditional values of the theocracy. He enhanced the roles of the legions in everyday matters beyond wars. He unearthed practices and preaches from the early days of Hazila's worship, some of them dating as far back as the times of the first tribe, leading modernized and more effective mummification practices to be forbidden in favor of old traditional practices which were held in greater ceremony but were much less effective in their preservation. In themselves, these moves meant little practicality, or so did Julianus think. In essence, however, Julianus was reawakening an old division of the theocracy. Pure citizens, descendants of the first tribe, and conquered nations were being divided. Politically, he believed that this way he would offer both sides what they truly desired, an increased influence of the Celasaur's office and the assembly, but a dogmatic enhancement of the role of the pantheon. On a personal level, however, Julianus was driven more by his theosophical views rather than his political sense. His analysis of dogma was specific and based on centuries of practices, and in his mind this was adamant and eternal. At the same time, he feared that the absolute unification of everything in the theocracy would lead to its collapse and dissolution, for it did not reflect the founding principles of the theocracy. His own experience in the Northern Rebellion had taught him that the strength of the theocracy lied in its diversity, and this, he believed, was best reflected in the form of a ruling pantheon. Hazila was the first among equal. The blessing he had received during the ceremony of his ascension to the office of Celasaur proved that beyond any doubt in his mind. His reformations, therefore, would advocate a return to the past, where each tribe was distinct, each church of the pantheon had its own practices, and the Celasaur with his assembly ensured the unity of the theocracy as a whole, mainly through control of the legions. The reaction was immediate from both sides of the schism, and his support began to dwindle faster than his reformations could be brought into effect. But the disposition of a Celasaur was a thing unheard of at the time. It took only 5 years for this to be rectified. The truth is that at the time, the very concept of tribes in different churches had much faded in the minds of the people and existed mostly in theory and politics. Centuries of living side by side, mixing and worshipping the same dogma, had forged a new identity in the minds of most of its inhabitants. This was Hazila's success, and Julianus' failure to realize. The diversity he dreamed of still existed, and the only thing his reforms achieved was to carve divisions. Overnight, families who had been native to Capitas for generations were treated and viewed by the theocracy as children to be guided at best, conquered to be ruled at worst. Allowed to follow their own gods and sensing a weak Celasaur supported by the weakened dogma, distant legions were perhaps unsurprisingly the first to cause tensions, rushing to the defense of their clergy or their province before they rushed to the support of the Celasaur. Pockets of insurgencies appeared throughout the land as the once complicated but understood unity of the theocracy was being redefined. Loath to do so, but forced by his political isolation, Julianus led the campaign against these insurrectionists himself, only to meet with another military failure. His own legion officers ignored him, and he was abandoned on the field of battle when none followed his charge. He was never seen again, neither alive nor dead. For the next 2 years, the assembly of the Celasaur would rule in his absence, and its efforts concentrated on the establishment of a new dogma that would bring peace to the land. Eventually, he would come to be remembered as the apostate Celasaur, his heretical views almost breaking the unity of Hazila's empire. His fate remains unknown and perhaps unimportant. His role, some note, was over, and his involuntary mission was accomplished to perfection. In the end, Julianus was never officially deposed. A new Celasaur was needed under the new dogma, and indeed Hazila's blessing was offered as Celasaur Iovanius ascended to office. The nuances of the new dogma were as numerous as they were complicated. The end result, however, is known. The Domini Dominium was established as all the people and all the churches were united under the banner of Hazila Pantocrator. Hazila was being forged into the undisputed ruler of the people, and more importantly, the pantheon. Conjunctures and Conjectures by Benjamin Toke, Volume 6, Divine Influences on Social Evolution and Decay. We're fully aware that our research and theories will once more be scrutinized, then ridiculed, being attributed to a so-called mental condition and an apparent brilliance in analyzing patterns that unfortunately often serves as fuel for a need to find patterns when none exist. It has been long suggested that this researcher's study in 3 different chapters, as well as this researcher's field of expertise in influences of primordial motes in time and space, cloud rationality and allow for external influences to constantly overshadow the power and influence of pure human nature in historical events. Our reply to such criticisms is simple. 5 volumes in this popular and financially profitable series of conjunctures and conjectures. I am Kautuk, you are risen. Whatever that means. Rather than provide answers with a mantle of self-appointed authority, our works are meant to inspire questions and challenge dogma, based on rational patterns, an attitude that could have, perhaps, averted disaster once. The dates proposed in this timeline are, with the exception of course of certain well-documented events, not accurate in the most traditional sense and are in fact mostly speculations. Speculations, however, they are based on the application of specific patterns and rules of time and social evolution, such as Fatima's regulations, Enditus' law of momentary trees, Solon's rule of social pattern repetition, and our own Tok's paradigm of entwined chronomarks. As the influence of divine intervention and the advancement of a society is hard to record or account for, we will admit that the applications of these patterns and laws were done by approximation. Later in this introduction, we will present exactly which pattern were applied, why those were chosen, examples of other applications of said patterns, and the projected influence of the divine on them. Before we dive into that analysis, however, it is imperative that we attempt a glimpse of the grand picture. Time is the great dance of the cosmos, and before we explore its pattern step by step, it is to the benefit of learning that we first observe the entire routine. Circa 1900 AR, the discovery of Hazila. This we believe to be a misrepresentation of the truth and a conveniently simplification of facts. Pre-humans had existed for millennia before this, as made evident by the proto-myths concerning the breaking and the first war. We propose that a more accurate representation would be the first tribe discovers a primordial mote and begins a systemic worship that will eventually forge Hazila, which is admittedly less catchy and a bit of a mouthful. And in this tome, we will explore the possibility of more than one tribe having discovered the primordial mote before the first tribe, as well as their gruesome fate at the hands of the things that dwell in the deeps below the abandoned and guarded holds. 1900 to 1700 AR, the Firestone. At this time, the mote that would be Hazila is slowly shaped as a life-giving god of fire and stone by the primitive minds of the first tribe. Its people begin to wield fire but are slow to master its use. Modern linguists propose that because of this, the name Hazila means burning stone, firestone, or inner sun. Others underline the lack of evidence to this and propose that it is connected to the sorcerer word for origin. Others still suggest that it is a case of onomatopoeia, attributing to the sound a fire would make when trying to speak. In this chapter, we will explore the possibility that Hazila indeed is a name, one, however, discovered not forged by the first tribe, one that was always meant to describe just one thing, the small aspect of creation, that specific primordial mote. 1700 to 1600 AR, the Bronze Covenant. The evolution of the first tribe society accelerates as Hazila's own consciousness resembles that of a newborn. The creation of tools fitting for human need allows for agriculture to evolve. It is generally believed that at this time a large portion of the first tribe migrated outside the hold and put their new tools to use. In this chapter, we will explore the inconsistencies of these paradigms. We will suggest that while possibly still largely instinctual, the foundations of Hazila's individuality had already been largely formed, and that the exodus from the hold was part of a covenant between a god and his faithful. His proto-clergy would force the main tribe outside, paving the way for Hazila's own escape, in exchange for knowledge privy only to them. 1600 to 1400 AR, the Iron Covenant. Having been propelled through a Bronze Age within decades, the cult of the old god emerges clad in iron, the progenitors of his legion. While bronze tools and weaponry had ensured the safety of the first tribe from the predations of other tribes, iron will ensure dominance and expansion. Here we will reinforce our suspicion from the previous chapter that the symbiosis of Hazila with the first tribe, and especially his clergy, was deliberate, and the new covenant had been forged. In exchange for dominance over the fields of battle, and therefore expansion of their rule, Hazila would gain more followers, and thus, more worship. 1400 to 1300 AR, the Sun's Son. The academic society generally accepts that at this time, Hazila's longing for the times of creation are interpreted by his clergy as him once being a part of the sun, come to the world to teach and guide them. Thus the paradigm of conquest will shift into one of assimilation where possible. It will be our suggestion that there is enough evidence to suggest that by this time Hazila had already formed full consciousness and a solid understanding of human nature. Surprised by how fast the warring tribes had assimilated his teachings in terms of handling bronze and iron, Hazila is plagued by two things: humanity's balanced nature and his slow understanding of his new, more advanced teachings, as well as the memories of warring Dweghom and what war did to their society and unity. He therefore shifts the paradigm of conquest and introduces the gold, the sun's metal, allowing for trade to develop. Circa 1300 AR, the Exodus. With gold and steel wielded in equal measure, Hazila has now expanded his influence over a much larger pool of worshippers. This offers him the strength to finally break free from the Dragon Forge and follow his worshippers to the surface. It is our suggestion that this was a necessity as much as it was a desire for freedom. Spurred by the return of the dwellers below, Hazila leaves the hold for fear of confronting the motes of destruction and their hosts that plague the depths of the hold. 1300 to 1100 AR. The careful approach and the birth of adversaries. The aforementioned encounters will in the end serve him. In the surface, he will perceive more motes and primordial shards attached to other tribes and human groups. These he will approach with care, assimilating some or cooperating with others. While it is largely believed that with those of destruction, his people go to war to eliminate their pool of worship, we will explore evidence to the contrary. At this time, an elaborate group of adversaries will be brought into the dogma, and familiar names such as Bezul, Balbus, Yurkul, etc. will appear in religious preachings. While the details of that period's dogma elude us, we believe that their inclusion to the faith allowed for their sustenance through controlled worship, while enhancing Hazila's image as a savior. These adversaries come to resemble demonic beings of fire and magma coming from below, where else the mode of creation placed the origin of its enemies. This, we will suggest, also explains why such an important landmark such as the first tribe's hold has been forgotten, shedding the primal barbaric worship of the past and possibly included anything from human sacrifices to aspects known what else. While dispelling the anathema of his imprisonment, Hazila turns his old dwelling place into a promise of hell. 1100 to 800 AR, the years of expansion. In a scant 300 years, Hazila will come to forge the single largest empire the continent has ever known. It is generally believed that the aftermath of the First War, as well as the isolationism of the elder races, largely allowed for this to happen unopposed. This we will question through a series of events that can be highlighted in this period. Circa 1000 AR, Hazila will fight a coalition of neighboring tribes of Galantoni that worship another shard of creation, Cleon. Even though his legion lost a significant battle, peace would be brokered, mainly due to the trade's influence and understanding reached between Cleon and Hazila. A few decades later, 950 AR, the Bewerer worshippers of Nen or Ninhua will also join Hazila's empire. By 800 AR, the triumvirate reigns over the pantheon of 12, while an entire legion of lesser deities complete Hazila's fledgling celestial host. On a divine level, therefore, a semblance of peace has been established, and yet the Cletoni, who follow Ninhua, will not really join until 700 AR, and the Severus, who served Sabafu, another name for Cleon, will continue to resist the Dominion's influence even until the fall. While many attribute these to Ninhua and Cleon's mistrust towards Hazila, we will propose and support that the influence of the Weavers and the Spires respectively would sway those two tribes to constantly challenge the Dominion and Hazila from within, paving the way for its fall. 800 to 330, the Golden Age. The so-called Golden Age of Dominion will see Capitas become the center of the civilized world, the flourish of magic and knowledge, and the advancement of humanity to levels we have yet to discover. This, we propose, is but a facade, and humanity's advancement should be attributed to the relative peace they were offered. This short-lived glory of the triumvirate will fade as quickly as it rose, and the complex realities of such vast an empire will lead to constant shifts in dogma of the theocracy, multiple name changes in gods, and unending adjustments to the divine dominions of certain deities. Already by 750 AR, the legions will be forbidden to worship any deity, as celestial power struggles turned from the fields of battle of the previous centuries to the political intricacies of a theocracy bureaucracy where Hazila had the upper hand. By 600 AR, the Domini Dominion will be established, suggesting that Hazila's quest for power had become unending. All these, we propose, can serve as proof that the fall of the Dominion was already a matter of time. 313 AR, the Last Crusade. Nothing summarizes Hazila's decay and power loss more than the words that launched the Last Crusade. Build ships, you have run out of men to conquer. To this popular understanding, we will add the possibility that there was method in the madness. While we offer little insight to the events of Northern Ragnarok, we will postulate that this rushed, almost suicidal crusade was neither the desperate act of a divine monarch challenged by a distant pantheon, nor the maddened whim of a deranged mind. Instead, we will propose that it is conceivable that such a surgical strike to the Dominion's infrastructure through a failure of such proportions could conceivably have been deliberate, heralding what was to follow. 301. The Falling. The last centuries of the Dominion are largely attributed to Hazila's absence rather than his design. While we are inclined to accept this, we will challenge this theory. If Hazila was gone, why would none of the rest of the pantheon, much more so the other two of the triumvirate, try and rein in the obvious destruction that was befalling the Dominion? Were they rendered useless by the machinations of Hazila? Or did perhaps humanity's last hopes allow for the destruction to occur? We will explore this possibility with certain arguments and theories in the following subchapters. 280 AR, the Cletoni Wave. If Hazila had indeed gone without trace, it is easy to attribute the exodus of Ninhua's favorite children to her foresight. As we are disinclined to base historical certainties to divine mysteries, however, we will explore the possibility that Ninhua had more than foresight to count on for her decision. Similar principal question can be asked about both the Galatoni Wave and the Remnant Wave. 151 AR, the Battle of the Waste. From Cleon's point of view, rather than to try and stop the rapid decline of the Dominion, we see him actively and strongly support the exodus of his last legion to the point of direct confrontation with the Celasaur. Could this battle mirror the confrontation of the heavens? If so, why did Cleon's chosen stand alone? 900 AR, the Exile Campaign. Even as the Elder Races ravages the Dominion's people and lands, Cleon, Ninhua, and the Old Pantheon do little to protect their worshippers. Were they engaged in their own skirmishes and power struggles, stopped perhaps by one or more of their own? Or was it a deliberate decision to allow for the destruction to come and, more importantly, for Hazila to be destroyed? 0. The Fall. In this, our epilogue, we will examine how inevitable the fall was. Reviewing all the previously suggested evidence and theories, we will present a pattern in its totality that will attempt not to answer questions, but raise them. Was the fall as inevitable as it seems in retrospect? Did fault lie in the gods, humans, or even the elder races for this destruction? The Hermits of Samash All-Seeing. Throughout the span of the Dominion in both time and geography, the worship of Hazila was as multi-faced as it was complicated and adaptive. Whether by ambition, drive, memories of a bygone time, admiration or cunning, or even a combination of all of these, Hazila reached for the mantle of the sun early on his career as god protector of the first tribe. But the scores of tribes converted, assimilated, conquered, or annexed by Hazila's first tribe demanded for Hazila to assume different names, personas, and aspects of portfolios, as the sun was revered by nigh all of them. This, of course, served the Pantocrator well in his eventual quest for further elevation and eventually absolute dominion over gods and mortals alike. The complexity of his worship allowed for versatility and constant change, while the different approaches to the same theme by different tribes allowed Hazila to dip into the portfolios of others among his pantheon, keeping the power of the greatest of them in check, while eventually subsuming lesser ones completely. The end result, some believe, was madness and the fall, scattered and pulled in as many directions as there were personas and titles in his honorifics. Hazila's very nature would be broken, or so they say, but there were lesser, more mundane consequences to this. By the 3rd century PR, the worship of Hazila would sometimes vary outside of Capitas, and the list of monastic orders, brotherhoods, and lesser churches devoted to Hazila were too numerous, too scattered, and often too obscured to be remembered by most, save perhaps the Relator Fidelium, the chronicler of the faithful. Hazila's Centaurs ensured that these monastic orders and churches, both large and small, were preserved and financially secured. Wishing for this diversity to keep him agile, Hazila empowered them in different degrees, offering land, financing structures, and even awarding tithing rights to the surrounding areas. Granting them allowances in their practices, these orders often escaped the jurisdiction of all but the Centaur, including the Keeper of Prayers. Most importantly of all, however, they were not only allowed but empowered in their worship. Recruiting and ensuring the continuation of these orders, brotherhoods, and sisterhoods was not only encouraged but actively supported. In the case of the Hermits of Samash, the all-seeing, the practice was as obscure as it was extreme, and extremely effective. The sun god, Samashut, was originally worshipped by the Shakadi, the one people that had rivaled the first tribe in their ingenuity and advancement. Some believe due to the sponsorship of a member of the dictatorate. So much so, in fact, that Hazila's early legions never risked meeting them in battle. Instead, Hazila appeared to them as Samashut personified, and while not all followed him readily, the rest, as they say, is history, and the Shakadi were soon brought under Hazila's banner. Whether there had actually been a person or primordial chaur behind Samashut originally, or if his worship simply revered the concept of the sun, it has been forgotten. But regardless, the identity of Samashut gradually denigrating to Samash, or Hazila Samash, was one of the first the Hazila adopted beyond his own. Before Hazila assumed the persona, Samashut was an all-seeing god of the sun, judge of the living and dead in equal measure. While this role was usually reserved for the seer of the pantheon, and his personas as Orcos Ramadatus, the Hermits of Samash all-seeing remained faithful to the traditional worship, and Hazila, fearing the seer almost as much as his triumvirate partners, made sure they kept doing so. Entrenched far up the slopes of the eastern Hern mountain range, the Temple of Eyes doubled down as a prison for the most ruthless and violent criminals condemned to death. While there were locals who were ready to serve their local tithe lords, the hermits mostly depended on their guests for recruitment, offering a chance to life through dedication to Hazila Samash and the Hermetical Order, those which Hazila blessed at the end of their trial periods and moments before their execution would owe their lives to him, literally, and their hermit brothers and sisters. The centuries of decline before Hazila's cataclysmic fall did not leave the hermits or any other monastic order unaffected. The greatest among them had become paramount cogs in the complex machinations of the theocracy of the Dominion, acting as local authorities side by side with local praetors and proconsuls, and thus a danger to the authority of the Centaurs who, in Hazila's absence, held their offices through uncertainty and constant challenges. Their authority over locally assigned legions was paramount in the decision to disband them, and the turmoil this led to. By the time of Hazila's fall, many of them had been crippled or eradicated completely, but not all. The lesser ones, such as the Hermits of Samash, scattered throughout the Dominion's lands and even beyond, and isolated in their monasteries and temples, would be forced to bar their gates and keep a low profile. Without Hazila's protection, they rightfully feared their privileges could draw envious eyes. In the centuries that followed, most of them would be completely forgotten and ignored. Their devoted faithful almost completely isolated, save for new recruits and accolades, would become an echo chamber of worship and zealotry. For some of them, perhaps too many by any logical account, this proved their salvation, and treasuring their monasteries and temples far from the centers of civilization and destruction, they would survive the fall. This was the case of the Hermits of Samash, composed almost exclusively by fanatic criminals who, as they saw it, owed their lives to Hazilas personally. The Hermits would survive the first years of the fall by what little life their modest monastery garden and farm animals could offer for as long as those endured. Eventually, when that proved too little and the animals perished from starvation and dehydration, they turned to their carcasses, then the bodies of their own dead compatriots around the temple, until ultimately they turned to the bodies of their own prisoners and what few deranged survivors they could hunt. Despairing in their zealotry for being abandoned, an expedition was sent to Capitas, led by one brother Hannibus and 6 others. Months passed, then a year, until the remaining hermits turned for substance to those among them who failed one of their many grueling tests of fate, and despite the monstrosities committed, the hermits saw their situation as tests from their god, as they were rewarded. On a grey eve, like all the others before it, a pale light shone through the ashen mist outside the temple's gates. Then the heavy doors of the temple opened, its creaking protest heralding the dawn of new life. Brother Hannibus, carrying a torch with dark flame, had walked in. He found the half-remains of most scattered around the temple grounds. Others he found in weak embraces, struggling to muster the strength for a taste of flesh or blood. Others still he found having locked themselves in the prison cells to stay out of reach from their brethren, their own bite marks on their skin. The good brother smiled. "I see you are ready," he said, as he lowered the torch on each of them, offering an eternity in the embrace of their god. Today even the rest of the Keres and the Moroi shy away from the blood-crimson cowls of the Hermits of the Samash All-Seeing. Old Faith and New Faiths. Primordial Patterns by Benjamin Tock and A.R. Chapter 3. Old Faith and New Faiths. Already during the centuries of chaos which preceded Hazila's fall, many were those who spoke of the sin of man. With the Old Dominion being a pure and undisputed theocracy, the political crisis that was spawned by Hazila's absence after the Last Crusade was, by extension, also a crisis of faith. Coupled with the continuous declaration of holy wars, this not only caused fragmentation of the Dominion society, but also allowed for ideas which derived from the established dogma to flourish. Where the motives were spiritual or political, in order to challenge the hierarchy, one had to question the faith itself. This was one of the many reasons for which the legions were forbidden from practicing any form of official worship. A mandate that was loosely enforced at best, as military appointments fell in the upper echelons of the theocracy. The ideas behind these emerging heterodoxies were many and differed vastly at that point, often driven more by circumstance than by a wish to reach a new truth. All the same, an understandable pattern could be discerned. The All-Father's absence could only mean the failure of man, and this of course not only included but mainly referred to the holders of high offices in the hierarchy of the theocracy, including the Chelisaurs. Already at that time, some much more timid voices spoke of failure of God instead, but those were usually quickly silenced. The citizens of the Old Dominion were, after all, a God-fearing people. Thus, while a great majority of the refugees that left the Old Dominion were trying to escape the chaos and violence that threatened their lives or had destroyed their properties, many were those that simply had to leave, unhunted by the theocracy for their heretical suggestions. As the lines between state, religion, and army were blurred for so long, especially during the Galotani wave, many were the officers of the disbanded legions, ranging from legatai to strategoi to centurions and legionnaires that had to escape prosecution for their beliefs. One must remember, however, that by the time most of the people had never witnessed the glory of Hazila and his pantheon as their ancestors had, their perception of religion lay closer to the mismanagement and violence that it did to guidance, protection, and inspiration. The deconstruction of their society would lead many to challenge the authority of religion over their lives. Thus, among the populations of their refugee groups, most once faithful minds were questioned their beliefs, while the words of the few fervent preachers were largely ignored at first, if not silenced by force. No one, after all, wished to hear that they were responsible for the misfortunes simply because they did not believe enough. Eventually, however, some of those preachers evolved to fill more traditional duties of priests almost by necessity, as people would turn to them for practical matters of a ritualistic nature, like the performance of ceremonies such as weddings or funerals. In time, and as the desperation of their situation and the fear of the unknown would grow, the refugees would turn to these preachers for spiritual guidance and support. By that time, the two common messages those zealous speakers delivered were simple. The bureaucracy has guided us astray from God, and we, having chosen to escape their decadence, must repent for following them. From these early preachers among the refugees, the first apostates of the Theist Church would later be drawn, while many a faithful soldier who safeguarded their group from the perils of the journey would be elevated to sainthood posthumously. Once the bounty was reached, such preachers would come to roam the settlements, performing the same ritualistic duties that they had during the long journey west. In an attempt to elevate their own prestige, but also to provide some sense of stability, some leaders would invite them to stay in their courts permanently, and the first timid connections to nobility began to be forged. In the second assembly of nobles, priests were brought along or sometimes invited so long as they were leaders of groups. If there were something the assembly revealed, however, it was two things. The first was that the ghost of a divine mandate behind leadership still lingered in the memories of the Dominion's refugees, and while the memory was probably bitter and distrustful, the connection was there. The greatest revelation, however, that the priests got from the assembly was that as individuals they had very little influence, and for the first time discussions were taking place about the meaning of the fall. However, since many of them were too attached to their own ideas and the previous dogma of the theocracy, it would take a new generation of preachers for those discussions to bear fruit. By the mid-1st century after the fall, these preachers would show some signs of cooperation. Efforts were made to amass faithful congregation, and their teachings displayed much greater similarities than those of their predecessors, concentrating on a central message of mankind's failure in the eyes of God. At the same time, they displayed an increasing attachment to the seats of power, with priests frequently found in courts as representatives of their flock. The arrival of the order saw those efforts thwarted. As much as the orders originally shied away from any settlement's inner politics, their involvement always came to stipulation concerning the absence of priests and the worship from the councils of administration. Shunned by the seats of power, the preachers turned to the public for support in a much more coordinated manner. In their campaign, they spoke of one God for whom the name Theos spread fast. In their hubris, the corrupt leadership of mankind tried to elevate themselves to the heavens, attempting to replicate the divine power of miracles. The instrument of their blasphemy was magic, an unnatural condition manifesting in souls that are not attuned to the divine balance of Theos. To shield mankind from its own profanity, Theos' own champion cast himself down from heaven, destroying the blasphemers. It was that sacrifice which mankind had to honor, this crime which demanded penance, this hubris for which humanity had to atone. While this early obsession with magic would in time be forced to the sidelines of the Theist faith, at the time fear and hate towards magic spread and scattered witch burnings occurred, but the order swiftly and aggressively put an end to such practices as well as to many of their instigators. From the perspective of the orders, however, the very fact that they had to intervene underlined that the influence of these preachers and their teachings proved much more widespread and influential than they had thought until then. While their own initial violent reaction alienated many, at a later time a new response to this rising faith was offered. Heralded by one Rosmund Ludus, a new sideline paradigm began spreading during the 9th decade PR. It was never mankind that fell, it was only an aspect of God, for divinity itself is not infallible. Deus, who was above perception, could not be put in one form or be worshipped in one manner. The betterment of each of the faithful was a duty to the divine, for he was part of everything, and the people were part of him. He was to be approached by each in their own way, worshipping the aspect, the fraction of the absolute existence which is God, which is closest to one's own understanding, and strive for perfection in that aspect. This faith, which was stripped of heavy ritualism and moved far from the perception of a few chosen and concentrated more on each person's connection to the divine, would in time resonate to the common people. With the above in mind, two questions can be asked. Considering the theosophical debates that consumed the Old Dominion during the centuries of the fall, can it really seem so surprising that the anointed, each expressing entirely different aspects and time periods of Hazila's worship, do not coexist in harmony, but rather war and bicker about the will of their god? As an extension of that question, and considering the repetition of this pattern, one could possibly even argue that such debates are indeed part of Hazila's worship, that the god himself is ever changing, or at least pulled by worship in so many different directions. At the same time, however, considering the roots of modern theism was the appearance of deism and their fragmenting dogma such an unforeseeable event, or could it mirror the pattern of the past? Are humanity and the divinity alike bound to repeat past mistakes? In many ways, while not worshipping Hazila, the Theist Church is the distant spiritual successor of the Old Dominion's theocracy, with its earliest teachings and its ritualism heavily influenced by old worship practices. With that in mind, deism could be seen as planned and channeled avenue for the fragmentation that worshipping an absolute had historically led to. Based on that, many see the intellect of the orders behind the deist movement and point to their tolerance toward Rosmun and his followers. Indeed, there are many indications that the orders would not only allow the early deists to preach freely, but also supported and provided escorts as they moved from one settlement to the next. While the generally accepted motive behind the support was political in its nature, with the orders trying to stifle the new fledgling church, one must not dismiss a greater purpose, distancing humanity from even the most remote aspects of Hazila's worship. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in the end it was the skeptics that the orders truly pledged their allegiance. Born out of the mistrust towards the divine caused by the fall, the skeptics doubted not simply the need for religion, but the very absolute nature of the divine. According to them, gods were entities of an elevated power rather than superior existences of an entirely different nature than the rest of the universe. Therefore, by default, worshipping them served them alone, never the worshipper. The Whisperer. Report number 665-42-12 by Sister Questor Eva Crusandi, Ashen Dawn Archives. Object name: The Whisperer, Anointed. Known aliases: Veiled Lady, Whispering Bride, Hidden Madonna, Lady of Whispers, The Champion's Bride, Eternal Maiden. I am able to report that some theories and speculations concerning the Whisperer, mainly put forth by my predecessor, the late Brother Questor Matthias of Kunsk, have been, if not confirmed, then heavily supported by new evidence. As was Brother Matthias' suspicion, it would appear that the Whisperer has been forging groups in the places where she has visited, from secret societies to heresies or cults for the deranged or desperate. It should be noted that the presence and activities of such groups have been our main means of tracking her movement. Thus, this conclusion could be based on our limited understanding and perception of her own activities, movements, and motifs. An alternate interpretation for the appearance of these groups is that they are simply fueled by her mere presence, a byproduct of her appearance more than the results of her devices. While there are supporters of this theory among my team, I myself do not adopt this interpretation, and I base this on several observations. I must note that the Whisperer has portrayed little to no interest in the fate of her groups after their creation. She has neither reacted, opposed, or attempted to thwart the elimination of any of them, either by us, the churches, or local authorities. Furthermore, these groups seem isolated and operating separately, each with its own modus operandi and adopting different rituals and beliefs. To this day, and throughout the years of observations, the different groups have never contacted or cooperated with their counterparts. These points could support a theory of lack of intention behind their creation. However, such differences could also be perceived as planned. Despite their differences, it must be underlined that to our knowledge, the different groups have never clashed with each other. Ritualistic fanaticism, which seems to be the most apparent common denominator among the different groups, rarely leaves room for competition or alternate dogmas, and yet not once, not even when present in the same cities, have these different groups vied for power and influence among those predisposed to such extremes. Intrigued by this observation, further investigations revealed that their differences are surface level only. While rituals and approaches differ, these groups share core beliefs and understandings. To our understanding, the Whisperer approaches entirely different groups of people, from the fanatically zealous or the bored privileged to the destitute, hurt, desperate, and miserable. Thus it seems natural to employ different means of approach that would resonate better with each targeted social group. Her cults often start as small heresy to the Theist creed or new interpretation of existing day. When left unchecked, a few of these groups evolved into death cults, which engage in violent conversions, abductions, ritualistic murders, whose rituals, however, may vary from extremely violent to kind poisoning, while a number of them have been led to mass suicides, especially among those groups that have avoided detection for years. Such extremes, which have proved paramount to the investigation, must be perceived as rare, or at least to confirmed occasions, her teachings prevailed over a young gentlemen's club, namely the Pragian Society of Hunt and Literature, a small brotherhood of knights, the Lercinian Knights of the Little Lady, where the teachings of the Whisperer were embraced as philosophical ideas and interpretations of the Oath of Fealty respectively. The discovery of these groups was entirely accidental, which alarmingly could propose that more such cautious groups could exist. In fact, it could be speculated that the vast majority of the Whisperer's groups remain introverted and preferring quiet conversion to aggressive methods that risk attracting attention. In the end, however, all types share one common goal: gain oaths of fealty from their followers, or victims. This is done in the name of the champion returned, the Savior's Son, the All-Father, sometimes undying All-Father, and even if rarely so, Hazila by name. This last observation is perhaps the greatest indication that the Whisperer is purposefully bringing such groups of people together, founding cults and heresies where the ground is fertile. If their presence was a simple byproduct, logic would suggest that at least some of those groups would turn their devotion to the Whisperer herself. While the Veiled Lady is often the object of admiration and adoration, she has, without fail, never been the central figure of the belief system of these groups. The presence of the Whisperer herself has been partially confirmed to date in 13 different cities on the outskirts of the Heartlands. While it has been suggested that her presence in the kingdoms may date to decades, if not centuries, there is little to no evidence to substantially support such an extreme scenario. Even so, one should not dismiss it entirely. While we can be reasonably certain of her presence at specific places, or even during specific dates, she remains elusive. No eyewitnesses can be presented, and we have only been able to place her presence after she had departed, or at least after her public appearances had ceased in specific areas. Despite the numerous reports and reasonably accurate tracking of her movements, no discernible pattern can be detected, and therefore none of our predictions so far have been successful. It must be admitted that we are no closer now to apprehending or terminating her than we were 5 years ago. Conclusion. Based on the above observations, I propose that the purpose of this anointed existence is, for lack of a better term, recruitment. Despite past failures, suggested course of action must remain infiltration of these groups, followed by extraction and/or termination of the Whisperer herself. A request for arms. A report from Head Mortician Saulorius, 42nd Auxiliary Crypt, Still Lake, Capitas, Part 1. Your Eminence, as Head Mortician of the 42nd Auxiliary Crypt, I must humbly request your immediate attention, for matters have taken a grave turn in the most unusual fashion. Those so far inanimate have begun to rise in alarming number. Forgive my brashness, Your Eminence, but I was under the impression that the cadavers under my care were to remain exactly that, cadavers. While I do not mean to imply, even in the slightest, that I resent this glorious gift of his, I must note that me and my assistants do not possess the capacity to support the sheer volume of our risen brethren. Your Eminence, allow me to refresh your memory, for I know it to be burdened by matters of elevated importance. The 4th and 2nd auxiliary crypts, like many other such related branches, were used to house the common folk. Such individuals, unlike the priests and legionaries that made up a good portion of our city's populace so far, could not afford the latest and greatest in the embalming and entombment arts. When not preserved in the most precise way possible, remains succumb to deficiencies after several hundreds of years of excessive moisture, carcass beetle breeding cycles, and the creative segmentation due to space constraints. Even as it would serve as an eternity of aggravation for their caretakers, all this would remain in the realm of ignorant inconvenience for the awakened themselves. After all, most of them are neither aware nor have any needs, demands, or role to play, and their existence plague none but your humble servants of the 42nd Auxiliary Crypt. However, under the direct order of the Anointed Keeper, we are to help the awakened to, and I quote, return to active duty, serving in any capacity they can. Please understand, Your Holiness, that this is not an aesthetic conundrum. While some of the newly risen have emerged mostly intact, a missing finger or two, nothing of concern, most found themselves missing entire limbs or sections of their bodies. Blacksmiths without their hammer-striking arms, tailors without opposable thumbs, farmers without legs, criers without jaws, and the list goes on. As you can understand, such occurrences are not optimal. To add to the complexity of this situation, these poor souls are not fully aware either of their current state or their surroundings. Seeing an oarsman trying to maneuver a coffin as if it were a seafaring vessel, not only does it become quite tedious after the 8th day in a row, it also rather spectacularly fails to fulfill the mandate of the aforementioned anointed decree. I must confess that my colleagues and myself are at a loss about the practicalities of executing the order given by the anointed keeper. Rest assured, me and my assistants are hard at work to find a solution to this conundrum, as I certainly do not wish to burden you with the tedium that is practical problem solving, and will inform you of our progress in a subsequent report. However, in the meantime, I must humbly request that Your Eminence intervenes and explains to the Anointed Keeper of the impracticalities of his decree, and that assistance and guidance be provided to his humble servants. As to the means, methods, and materials can be employed for its execution. Your humble and grateful servant, Xalorius, Head Mortician. A report from Head Mortician Xalorius, 42nd Auxiliary Crypts, Still Lake, Capitas, Part 2. Exalted Archimandrite. While I did not receive any response from Your Eminence during my first correspondence, I am undoubtedly sure that Your Eminence is preoccupied with matters of higher standing and will respond when the time is proper. I must sadly inform you that the situation has taken a dive into greater depths of desperation and impracticality. I must also regrettably inform you that while thy humble servant continues to serve in accordance with the tenets of his profession and the Lord's maxims, others seem to have abandoned both reason and decency. Allow me to explain. To contain the situation presented in my previous report, I have resorted to using discarded limbs from the crypt occupants that have, for the time being at least, decided to remain truly inanimate. This allowed for some repairs to be made, thus enabling crafters and other common people to at least present the capability to serve their purpose, despite their limited mental capacities. This is far from a perfect solution. Suitable limbs are in short supply indeed. Other replacements have been also tested, but any non-organic solution is futile to consider. Thus, I've come up with the following ingenious resolution. During my time studying in the Postern district, massive charnel houses were used to dispose of any material that was deemed unsuitable for burial. Such remains, though haphazardly stacked, were still treated with copious amounts of preservative chemicals and other such compounds, guaranteeing a relative level of enduring pristineness. Exhilarated at this prospect, I ordered said charnel house to be excavated and their repositories unsealed. To my dismay, I found that they had partially been looted. To my horror, that very same afternoon, a newly appointed anointed officer, serving anointed seer, sporting a suspiciously mismatching arm beneath their robes, presented themselves to me, demanding I deliver 1 blacksmith, 2 scribes, and 3 tailors in the best possible condition, but not demanding them to be fully functional. Your Eminence, I must implore you to take action. There is an entire, for lack of a better word, economy in the making. Arms, legs, organs, tendons, and other vital for animation materials are being smuggled about right under your humble servant's nasal orifices. And this smuggling ring is benefiting from the so far disregarded and ignored jurisdiction of the Morticians. This is a direct assault least of all to your servant's function, but also to your own influence and person, not to mention the decency of our Lord's ethics. Yet again, I must implore you to take action and humbly request your immediate assistance in this matter. These materials are yours by right. There is talk among the Morticians that a guild shall be formed, safeguarding the resources under their jurisdiction and control. We cannot allow all decency to be brushed aside. While I await for your instructions, I have taken the liberty to repair and hastily equip some former members of the militia, mandating them with the protection of the charnel house. I hope that said decision will be ratified by your response and actions. I most eagerly await for your response and approval of this urgent matter. Salorius, Head Mortician. The living world of the warlord. Hunted by the ghost of his past life, the warlord stood amidst the covered ruins of a city somewhere in the Dominion's old province of Galatonia. Unsure of purpose for himself and his army, his military mind focused on exploring the old province, both to get the lay of the land, but also to search for abandoned mausoleums that could provide new troops. As memories of his life before his anointment kept besieging his mind, tasks and objectives that would otherwise be simple were constantly second-guessed. Realizing that both himself and his army had no need for the considerations of the living, such as provisions, fresh water, or even rest, the warlord struggled to adopt a firm mindset about his methods. Ultimately, and ironically adopting advice given to him in his previous life, he decided a slow and steady approach was favorable as he learned to capitalize on the advantages he and his army held over the living. His first order of business, he decided, would be to excavate the ruins of the city around him. He would then use the old city, Divinia, as his own base of operations, not only to serve as headquarters for his legions, but also establish a seat of power against the anointed. Despite the obvious advantages against the living, however, the warlord was soon confronted with the obstacles that the troops had to overcome. Fueled not by true will but the will of their betters and their own instinctual urges offered by memories from their own lives, to locate these among them with more presence of mind, he assigned other officers to oversee operations, while he in turn oversaw the performance and capacity of his officers. One stood out amongst them, Sialarch Julius, who portrayed a near full character and free will. Craving intelligent conversation, he invited the officer to walk and oversee the works in person. It was during that walk and sparked by his conversation with the Ziliarch that the warlord realized just how much hatred he nurtured for the petty, insignificant wants and needs of the man he once had been, and partially was still. With the troops around him mirroring the hatred he himself felt for his own individuality, the warlord felt a surge of power from that hatred. Channeling the might to his troops, he allowed them to tap into their memories, a skill that would come useful in large combat situations. It was at that time that the barbarians of the wasteland launched their attack. The Battle of Divinia Ruins proved to the warlord just how inefficient his troops could be. His own presence on the field and their near-instant response to the surprise attack of the Wardun assured a victory the barbarians did not manage to disrupt his operations to any significant degree, and his losses were minimal. However, they managed to escape, likely having observed his operations near the crypts his troops were trying to unearth, thus able to report back about his purpose and objective in the area. The only appropriate response for the warlord would be to mobilize more troops to Capitas with eyes set on the barbarian wasteland and the lands of the living beyond them. The fate of the Centaurs, the Prodormi and the Kirkis. When it came to the vast empire that was the dominion of Hazila, a tapestry of nations and differing cultures under a single rule, there was one constant that defined all its citizenry: fate. Yet not all who called Hazila's empire their home were fortunate enough to possess the gift of fate, for non-believers were relatively sparse yet stubborn, and their refusal to acknowledge the almighty Pantocrator, one such group existed within the ranks of the bred, inserted into the folds of the dominion by the spires. The Centaurs never acquired the sense of belief and faith that permeated everyone around them. Stemming from their refusal to embrace and adopt the religious creed of the Dominion, the Centaurs at large were pushed to the very margins of civilization, creating nomadic societies that existed in relative isolation. Stubborn, brutish, and unruly by nature, the very existence of these unabsorbable centaur tribes was seen as a nuisance by many within the Dominion, for the persistent breed would often partake in detestable acts such as stealing, raiding, and even killing. As such, the institution of the Kerikes was born, forging a role for the centaurs within the Dominion that took free will out of the equation. Kerikes were centaurs that were taken by the Dominion at a young age, often through violent means, and were raised to become temple messengers. Extensively trained in the ways of war and fate from childhood, Kerikes would become lethal and efficient messengers, carrying communications over vast distances and using their immense speed and military prowess to protect such parcels. However, the second component of the Kerikes training never really materialized as it was intended. Though faithful to Hazila on the surface, none of the Kerikes ever truly believed in him earnestly, for their natural proclivities made the very concept of fate incomprehensible and impossible to their mind. As the fall slowly began to unfold, the Centaur tribes were one of the few groups within the crumbling Dominion that managed to thrive despite all odds, their distance from civilized society proving a saving grace during the societal collapse around them. In fact, with the legions disbanded, Hazila gone, his church in disarray, and unrest having descended into open civil war, the physical fortitude and unyielding nature made them ideal mercenaries. Despite of their prosecution initiated against the breed during the latest decades of the Dominion, many wealthy and powerful humans sought to acquire their services and pit them against their enemies. Their initial approach, serve or suffer the purge, was met by the characteristic stubbornness of the Centaurs. Eventually, however, a new approach was discovered: bribery. With generous amounts of materials and gold to counterbalance the threat of the purge, the choice proved easy. Thus, certain centaur population numbers were sheltered from the purge of the breed, creating a new institution, the prodormi, lacking the finesse and official training of their Kerikes peers, who often used bows and dexterous blades to quickly dispose of their enemies. The prodormi were more brutal and blunt, using overwhelming close-quarter force to dispose of those that stood against them, languishing in the violence they spread and the riches that came from it. The prodormi became a notable force during the times of the fall, serving those with the coin and means that were able to satisfy their hefty fees and shelter them from prosecution. And yet the persistent faithlessness and non-belief of the centaurs that lasted centuries was meant to crumble. When Hazila fell from his sky-bound dominion and plummeted into death's lifeless embrace, he quite literally tore open the very heavens with the cataclysmic ferocity of his death throes. The earth shook and the sky was torn asunder, revealing the plummeting wreckage of a dying god. The same dying god their forefathers had been denying for generations. Only then, when the very thing they had refused to acknowledge and venerate descended towards them from above, did their denial turn into true, unfiltered, and unquestioning belief. Much like the rest of the Dominion's population around them, the Centaurs prayed for salvation, and Hazila answered beyond death. While most who served the legions of the Old Dominion are mummified husks of their living selves, for fate and life is required to be raised in undeath, and countless faithful existed through the reign of the Dominion, such is not the case with the Centaurs. Those Kerikes and Prodormi who that were blessed with unlife were those that became faithful to him during his fall, having no time to decay and wither, and being raised almost immediately after his death. As such, they now serve the Old Dominion with a most unique honor, belonging to the chosen few that retain their flesh-bound form while they venture further into unlife. And this was the Roman-inspired faction for Conquest, the last argument of kings. I have to say, it's one of my favorite. I like the concept and the way things mix. I really like it. If you reached this far, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing. It helps the channel grow. I hope you like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Arrivederci.